You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Peryear, and as always, I'm very honored to be here alongside my co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be here.
Eugene, good to be back with you.
It's always good to be here. I almost said it was my pleasure, but
I know. I knew I could feel that coming. I was waiting for it. I almost took it from you.
Trying to police myself.
Well, Eugene, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everyone who's tuned in and everyone who's watching. We've got a great show for you here, as we always do. It's an action-packed show. We're going to be talking with people live on the ground in Cuba, talking about the just fizzling of the counter-revolutionary campaign that happened there just a few days ago. We're going to be talking about the Biden-Xi summit that took place at the start of this week. We're going to be talking about some of the flying under the radar, but very, very notable news about RUSSIAGATE. We're going to be talking about Ruchell, Magee, America's longest held political prisoner. And we're also going to talk about a big victory for the movement against police terrorism here in New York City. So there is a just start to finish packed show, very informative show, something that I think you will enjoy from start to finish, which is a good time to remind you, if you are watching, or wherever you may be watching, obviously you're watching, to go ahead and hit that share button so whoever is following you can follow us. And also, if you're watching on YouTube, just make sure that you hit the subscribe button and also make sure that you hit the bell. And then that way you will get all of the fantastic content that comes out here from Breakthrough News. You won't miss anything. And believe me, you don't want to miss anything, especially with Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Fantastic
That's my show.
Yes. It is. It is. One of them. Also, the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. Fantastic. Shout out to Kevin Gosselaar. Well, so here we are.
What?
You know, before
is happening this week?
I don't really know what's happening this week. It's the week before a holiday.
Yeah.
I don't know. In America, Thanksgiving. So I don't know if that does things slow down. Does your brain slow down? You thinking you're in that turkey? It's like the pre-Altriptyvan. That's
it feels like it.
The turkey substance that makes you sleepy, right?
Thanks-taking.
So.
I like that. Thanks-taking. I haven't heard that before. Yeah. Maybe
well,
I'm a little corny.
Sadly, I can't claim it. I don't know where I first heard it, but it definitely did not originate with me. But to the extent you heard it from me, feel free to use it. No intellectual property here on my sayings. I want people to be able to get the most out of their holiday with their family. And in fact, I should add, on the holiday with your family, everyone's thinking, oh, you're going to do a lot of arguing, a lot of politics. Do whatever you want to do. But this would be a great opportunity sitting around the dinner table to tell everyone you know to subscribe, follow, and patronize Breakthrough News. We'll do the fighting for you on all the controversial issues.
That could be taken in the wrong way.
It could be, but it won't be. And also, just a reminder, you can make donations in the Super Chat here on our YouTube feed, and if our censor, Rania, deems them to be acceptable, we will read out your comments if you want to include a comment. So with that, I think we can just jump right into the show here. I know we've got a lot going on. I don't know if our first guest is with us, but I'm hoping he is. But we want to start with the issue that we mentioned at the top of Ruchell Magee, the longest held political prisoner in the United States of America. I mean, he's actually, well, we'll get into it. Let me not editorialize. Very happy to be joined by Cameron Hurt, who is an organizer with the Coalition to Free Ruchell Magee, as well as a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Cameron, thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, just at the outset, Cameron, tell us who Ruchell Magee is and why he's being held.
Well, that's an excellent question, Eugene. Ruchell Magee, as you said, is the longest held political prisoner here in the United States, a country which doesn't even acknowledge that it has political prisoners. So we think even stating that is a huge statement. He was actually born March 17th, 1939, Louisiana. So very long time ago, he grew up in the Jim Crow South. He was actually locked up in a situation that very much echoes the Emmett Till situation. He already spent 7 years in prison, starting at the age of 16. He moves to Los Angeles in 1962 when he's finally released from Angola, which is, you know, a well-known former plantation turned prison. And what we want to say about this is that arrested on a $10 marijuana conviction. That is what actually lands him in prison for the first time, is that it was a drug deal gone wrong. The other person accuses him of kidnapping, and he ends up with basically a 1 year to life sentence. Like, he is basically railroaded. He's beaten by the police when he's arrested. And the point that we can make right here, starting in 1962, 63, is he spends essentially the vast majority of his life behind prison doors, whether it's in Louisiana and then in Los Angeles, he's arrested. So what he's most known for is actually his participation in the August 7th, 1970 rebellion, in which Jonathan Jackson, a well-known freedom fighter, actually led several prisoners in escaping temporarily. So on that date, Ruchell Magee and William Christmas were on the witness stand for the trial of James McClain, who was also being questioned for assaulting a guard, supposedly, after another prisoner was murdered. So Jonathan Jackson attempts to free his brother and the rest of the Soledad brothers by taking control of that Marin County courthouse. Ruchell was not an initiator of that. He was not a person who was knowledgeable about what was going to happen. But once it started, I mean, it's not like you have many choices. And what he decided to do was to get his case out to the media. He thought that I'm being treated as a slave inside. The only thing that I can do is take a move for my own freedom and liberation. Unfortunately, as many know, the San Quentin prison guards arrive and then they open fire on the group as they're leaving the building. They killed Jonathan Jackson, William Christmas, James McClain, as well as Judge Harold Haley. So that may seem shocking that prison guards shot their own judge. Ruchell is the sole survivor out of the people who broke out. Wow. And he has essentially been treated in that pariah way that, you know, we're going to make an example out of this brother because he would dare challenge the sanctity, the holiness of the U.S. state. So that's a great starting point. And it's unfortunate that, you know, people were pushed to that, but yeah.
No, I hear you 100%, and I think, you know, and of course, you know, Ruchell Magee is also taking on the moniker of Sin Q after, of course, the leader of the Amistad Rebellion, and I think that just hearing you tell that story, Cameron, it was just reminded me of, you know, almost like a slave narrative in a way, an escaped slave narrative. I mean, he was in a situation where he was offered freedom for, you know, being trapped in this unjust system, and here he is as a political prisoner. So, you know, obviously it has been quite some time that he has been incarcerated here on these charges since 1970. So what is the status of where he is right now? And I know there's obviously a campaign to free him, but what is the general context?
All right. Yeah. The comparison and what you said about slavery is very apt. It's very accurate. In his own words, and this is the person who has done so much to learn about the history of African liberation, of Black liberation in the United States. His words were slavery 400 years ago, slavery today. It's the same, but with a new name. So he went on to say that, you know, he wants to prove to the public that he has been railroaded, that he has been treated poorly, to say the least. The status of him right now, he's currently 82 years old. We have evidence that, you know, deems that he may be using a walker now. His health, of course, was at tremendous risk, just like all prisoners and political prisoners during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that continues to be a threat. And he currently has 2 motions in the legal system, which are a request to the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, to commute his sentence, and a hearing that he's trying to push in the Supreme Court. Ruchell actually has been denied parole 13 times. Actually, this December is going to mark 40 years since his first parole suitability hearing, way back in 1981. So let's just put this together, 58 years of incarceration. And the parole board is still saying, you do not have the right to leave this place. You are not ready to return back to society. But the thing I want to make super clear right here is that he was not convicted of murder in this. He was not found guilty of murder. And so much evidence points to the fact that the San Quentin guards actually murdered the judge. So essentially, he is just being punished for the bravery and the choices of Jonathan Jackson, of the other freedom fighters, not because he actually committed some egregious crime. He's actually been held much longer than the average sentence for murder, which is about 40 years.
I think that's such an important point as well, because it really gets to the idea of, political prisoners as a concept. And the idea, and as you mentioned at the outset, Cameron, this is the United States is a country that doesn't even recognize that it has political prisoners. And such a huge part of that is to treat political acts, liberatory acts, as criminal behavior and essentially lump them together. We see it all the time with uprisings presented as riots and so on and so forth. But this seems very much to speak to this long tradition in the United States of criminalizing dissent.
Absolutely. It's definitely a way of criminalizing dissent. I mean, we're looking back at him being first imprisoned for a substance that is now legal in California, marijuana. Then essentially the frustration of spending 7 years in a prison for something as small as that, a sentence that really was undeserved. So I didn't even mention that, before he really started to go out and make stronger political statements. He was also bound and gagged in trial. His own court-appointed attorney, like many Black defendants, actually betrayed him in a sense and pushed him to take a deal that actually didn't work because of that connection. So then once he makes such a political stance as allying with someone like Jonathan Jackson, and, the fact that it's well known that he was incredibly politically active, means that he's an incredible threat. I mean, to the eyes of the state at that point. But the fact of the matter is that he has not been a threat. And at 82 years old, there's no reason that he should still be in there. We believe that he should be out with his family, with his loved ones. And that's why in 2019, we created the Coalition to Free Ruchell Magee, which can be found at www.freeruchellmagee.org. There's so much information up there, so much that can be learned, but also a lot of information about the different people who have endorsed the campaign, which I would love to go into too if we have time.
You do have time. I'd certainly be interested to hear that. Who has endorsed this campaign?
So just to speak of a few individuals who we would like to mention, there's a long list, so forgive me that not everyone will be mentioned, but the chairman, Fred Hampton Jr., Jaleel Muntaqim, we have Harold Taylor of the San Francisco 8, as well as Hank Jones from the San Francisco 8. And we have 3 members of the San Quentin 6, Luis Talamontes, Willie Tate, and David Johnson. We also have, people like Gerald Horn from Freedom Now Radio, who I know Breakthrough News has definitely had many times. Brian Becker of the Answer Coalition, Gloria LaRiva, presidential candidate, Robin D.G. Kelly, professor of American history at UCLA. And the list really goes on. There's so many people who have said, this is absolutely ridiculous. We have to do something. And then with organizations, some of the organizations that have really helped propel this campaign forward have been Black August Los Angeles, the Answer Coalition, Fair Chance Project, the National Alumni Association for the Black Panther Party, Black Lives Matter Global Network, National Jericho Movement, Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and so many more. So we're always looking to build this list. Media, we were on Jared Ball's show, and many others. So we would love to continue expanding that.
Well, and before we let you go, Cameron, where can people find the Coalition to Free Ruchell Magee?
All right. So you can go to www.freeruchellmagee.org. That is the main hub of our website. And once you get to that website, there's so much that you can do from there. You can immediately sign our petition via Action Network that says, immediate commutation for Ruchell sentence. You can write to the governor's office in a matter of seconds. we're collecting as many letters as possible, trying to really make it evident that the community, the wider world of progressive and people who care about justice really support Ruchell. That he's not someone to be demonized, but he's somebody who deserves our full love and support. And I really hope that folks will check out that website, www.freeruchellmcgee.org.
Right on. Well, Cameron, I really appreciate you joining us and helping us learn more about Ruchell Magee and certainly how we can free him. And thanks for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much. See you soon.
Of course. Well, we're going to keep the movement moving on here, as they say, turning to another legal issue, if you will, maybe slightly broader than that, turning to RUSSIAGATE, which, believe it or not, many of us who were critics of RUSSIAGATE certainly now are being proven to have been right in our criticism. But nevertheless, to break all this down, we're very happy to have with us Aaron Mate, who's a journalist at The Gray Zone and the host of The Pushback with Aaron Mate. Aaron, thank you so much for being with us. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, no. We have a mute.
My bad. Here we go.
All good.
There we go.
I was just saying that I feel bad. You guys are doing so good keeping your show RUSSIAGATE free. And I'm spoiling the party.
Right?
I'm spoiling the party.
No, it's all good. I have a little PTSD when I think about RUSSIAGATE, but overall,
I do too. I'm
very happy to be able to
genuinely.
do it. So, Aaron, we've got, the sort of fruits or some of the fruits of the investigation by Mr. Durham and the Justice Department into the origins, essentially, of RUSSIAGATE that have been coming out. There have been some legal proceedings that have taken place. Help us understand the contours of what we're learning from this Durham investigation about the genesis of how RUSSIAGATE as we know it began.
What we're confirming is what, people like all of us here were saying from the start, that this whole RUSSIAGATE thing was a scam. It was cooked up by the Clinton campaign and pursued by allied people inside the national security state and, spread throughout the world by a really credulous media that didn't look at the available facts and instead wanted to advance this fashionable narrative that Russia was destroying U.S. democracy with its sophisticated Facebook ads and email hackers, and that Donald Trump and everyone he knew were somehow complicit, including by blackmail that Putin was hanging over Trump. And now we're learning basically how the scam was concocted. And one of the key ways was for the Clinton campaign to hire this firm called Fusion GPS, which in turn hired a former British spy named Christopher Steele, who hates Russia, has a real animus towards Russia. He thinks Russia wants to destroy the world, and he sees a conspiracy everywhere. He basically invented this fake dossier full of claims about the P-tape and, Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, going to Prague to pay off Russian hackers. And instead of this dossier being laughed at by the media and the FBI, they use this as source material. So the FBI got this dossier at some point in 2016. And when they went to a FISA court to start trying to get wiretap applications on a Trump associate named Carter Page, they cited the Steele dossier 4 times, even after they started learning that it was all fiction and paid for by the Clinton campaign. And the media portrayed Steele, instead of being this mentally unstable Russophobe, as this credible sleuth who had uncovered the real truth about Trump and Russia and just wanted to warn the world. And they still persisted with that, even when it was discovered in late 2017 that the Clinton campaign was paying for it. And now what we're learning from these indictments is that basically, whereas Steele claimed to have access to all these high-level Kremlin sources, he actually had access to one guy named Igor Danchenko, who he has a Russian passport. The problem is he lives in the U.S., and instead of having access to the Kremlin, he has much better access to the Beltway. He worked at a think tank called the Brookings Institution, which is also, by the way, heavily tied to the Clintons. And that was his main guy. And Danchenko was giving him all these ridiculous moronic claims about, a P-tape and blah, blah, blah. And that's what was going into the dossier. And we learned from this new indictment of Danchenko that he lied to the FBI in misleading them about his conversations with people who he used as subsources, one of whom he didn't even speak to. So Danchenko claimed he spoke to this one guy named Sergei Milyan, who's not even Russian, he's Belarusian, but he was the head of the Russian-American Chamber of Commerce. But it turns out they didn't even speak. So it's just one it's one it's one window into how this giant scam was concocted.
You know, Aaron, it's so fascinating how every few months it's like another piece of this Russiagate narrative. And this has been going on for years, but every few months for the last several years, another piece of this narrative that literally every single major media outlet in America and really more like the Western world has confirmed is true. Another piece just falls apart. At this point, it's like, there's almost nothing else left to hold this fraudulent narrative together. Yet, if you're watching the mainstream press, no one's been held accountable. No outlet has come out and said they were wrong. In fact, if I turn on any late night show, it's like they're still perpetuating this myth. It's like no matter what we find out was untrue, it becomes truer. Like, what does it say about our media apparatus and really our entire country that, you know, at least with Iraq WMDs, like they were like, oh, okay, there was no WMDs. We got it wrong. With this, there's been no accountability and no moment of people coming out and doing sort of like their mea culpas.
What it says is that our intelligentsia is basically a cult. And, you know, in this case of Russiagate, the narrative served such a convergence of powerful interests that it's just too big to fail. So, you know, the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, which is the dominant wing, which, you know, so many elite journalists and establishment news outlets identify with, they came up with this to basically deflect blame for losing to a buffoon, Donald Trump, among many other interests that it served for them. This dovetailed with the national security state, who didn't care that Trump was a racist or a misogynist, but he was just too erratic. Sometimes he actually blurted out honest things, and he said the truth. And he just was not a suitable steward for the global U.S. empire. And to top it off, he also was sometimes talking about cooperating with Russia, which was sort of like treated as venom from people in the national security state who wanted to increase confrontations with Russia, didn't want to cooperate with Russia in Syria, for example, didn't want to reach a deal with Russia and Ukraine, wanted to continue cold wars and dirty wars all around the world. And peace with Russia is an impediment to that. And then the media, too, this was great for them because they actually helped elect Trump. They gave him billions of dollars worth of free airtime. And this allowed them to deflect responsibility for their own culpability in electing Trump. Instead, they could blame it on Russian bots. And moreover, all of them could put forward this narrative that distracted the public from real, genuine dysfunctions that allowed a clown like Trump to get elected in the first place. And to look at those dysfunctions seriously would have meant questioning the capitalist system that all these powerful sectors enjoy power and privilege in. So it was just like this perfect convergence of nefarious, cynical, elite interests. And that's why I think it's just too big to fail. And that's why, like, Russiagators will not stop Russiagating. I mean, it really is a cult. So now the new narrative is, all right, Steele got it wrong, but the rest of it was right. And the reason Steele got it wrong is not because, you know, Steele is like a deranged Russophobe, but because he was fooled by this Russian who was feeding him Russian disinformation. They always find a way to avoid responsibility and blame Russia.
I mean, you know, it's one of these things, Aaron, that it's like you can't make it up when you sort of, I mean, even your initial capsule, I almost felt like I was through the looking glass, like, is this real? And, you know, I wonder, what does this also say about institutions like the FBI and others who it seems really expressed basically no disbelief at all when this was brought to them and sort of pushed on them and generally sort of jumped in to confirm?
I mean, it says that the intelligence community has a major problem both with lying to the public, which we already knew, but also with extreme, I think, Cold War chauvinism, where if you read some of the reporting from places like the New York Times, they talk about the reasons why the FBI was able to pursue this and turn this into this like all-consuming national security investigation of a presidential campaign and then a president is because it wasn't just things like the Steele dossier, but also they were seeing Trump on the campaign trail talk about getting along with Russia and also criticizing NATO. And in their minds, they just couldn't process that someone could actually believe those things genuinely, that the only explanation must be that they have to be some kind of potential Kremlin agent. And if you read their statements, I mean, they really are bigots when it comes to Russia. James Clapper, who was the head of national intelligence at the time of Russiagate, when the Russiagate investigation began. He said that Russians are genetically predisposed to lying, which is really ironic for James Clapper, who lied to Congress about spying on Americans. I mean, that's why Edward Snowden leaked the documents when he saw James Clapper lying. Clapper also, during the Iraq War, claimed that when he was a part of a naval intelligence wing, said that there was evidence of Saddam moving weapons of mass destruction into Syria. People like Peter Strzok, who's the FBI agent who opened up the Trump-Russia investigation, he sent all these text messages where he's saying stuff like, I hate the effing Russian, the cheating effing savages. Like, these people were deranged. And the fact that you have this strange character, Trump, freestyling his way to the presidency, while at the same time saying occasionally nice things about Russia and criticizing NATO, it just combined into this perfect storm where it became, for some reason, a legitimate move to investigate a presidential campaign and then fuel innuendo for 3 years that he was a Russian asset.
And I'm curious, Aaron, like, I think your thoughts on this, because it seems to me like this entire Russiagate narrative, even if it were to disappear tomorrow, we never heard about it ever again. There's a certain level of damage that it's done to like the psyche of Americans, because Americans have basically like been taught to overnight become fearful of any enemy that the FBI or whatever intelligence agency decides to say, like, did a cyber attack or did some invisible attack we can't see. So like today it's Russia, tomorrow it's Iran, the next day it's China, the next day it's Venezuela. They're all the big disinformation narrative. Like, that's the other thing that was fueled by Russiagate, this narrative that we have a disinformation problem, and it's been used to justify basically like all this censorship, supposedly of the far right, but really it just ends up being like people like us that get censored and suppressed. But I guess my question is, what is the overall damage that Russiagate has done to America, aside from just the issue of like, which is a big deal, of militarizing the situation between the US and Russia? But it goes beyond that, right?
Oh my God, there's so much damage. I mean, look, the damage to U.S.-Russia relations was really big. I mean, U.S.-Russia relations were already pretty bad, but they got even worse because part of the problem was this narrative that Trump was a Russian puppet. It incentivized everyone who believed in it to ignore the real actions that Trump was taking that were increasing tensions with Russia. So, launching a coup in Russia's ally, Venezuela, tearing up vital nuclear treaties, increasing war games on Russia's borders, bombing Russia's ally, Syria, twice. I mean, the U.S. media avoided all these issues even more because they undermined the fashionable narrative that Trump was really doing Putin's bidding. And yeah, when it comes to the impact on the left, I mean, look, basically Russian disinformation and Russian interference was basically turned into meaning anyone who the bipartisan U.S. establishment doesn't want. So first it was Trump, and then in 2020 during the Democratic primary, they Russiagated Bernie. They claim that Vladimir Putin wants to install Bernie as well, which is obvious. It was obvious all along that what was going on. It wasn't just a fake way to resist Trump. It was also a way to protect the power of the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party and basically suppress anyone deemed to be a threat to that. And look, a great example that I always give is that it meant that during the Trump era, there were bigger rallies to save Jeff Beauregard Sessions' job than there were to, save Obamacare or save the Iran nuclear deal. And liberal energies were diverted into this like ridiculous reality show. And it meant worshiping the CIA and the FBI and trying to fight to save the job of Jeff Sessions. I think that says it all.
It really does. I remember Sessions trying to present himself as some sort of like, martyr, like I resisted, whatever. I mean, truly one of the most execrable people to ever sit in the United States Senate.
Rachel Maddow.
Yeah,
Rachel Maddow, do you remember? Yeah.
No, go ahead, Ron.
No, I was just going to remind you that Rachel Maddow was like cheering on Jeff Sessions as a hero of America when was he pushed out or
when he was fired. When he was fired, she was like, "This is a break the fire glass moment. This is an emergency. All hands on deck." And they had these big protests that the liberals rallied. I went to one of them in New York. It was sad. Like, we're rallying for Jeff Sessions. Because, and for people who don't know, the fear was that the firing of Jeff Sessions meant that Robert Mueller's job was in danger. Robert Mueller, another upstanding character who, went to Congress and claimed at WMD. He rounded up Muslim immigrants after 9/11. he was turned into a savior figure overnight until, of course, he appeared publicly in Congress in July 2019, and he didn't even know the details of his own investigation. It was another sad display.
It really was. And the perverse incentive structure at all. I mean, all these people are writing books. I don't read many of the books, but they're getting millions of dollars in advances. And Rania mentioned this earlier. I mean, not only are people continuing to push the lie, they're actually profiting in huge sums for doing it. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that's what you need to get people pushing lies. But it does seem to really speak to just the overall feedback loop and kind of the media, book publishing, politics nexus that exists in our current moment.
Absolutely. And also it speaks to what Ronnie was talking about this disinformation obsession. It's also meant this new kind of cottage industry of like spook firms who like get paid millions of dollars to produce reports about Russian disinformation or Chinese disinformation, basically anything that can be used to gin up fear about whatever the official enemy is of the day. And one of those firms is this thing called New Knowledge. It's full of ex-State Department people. They've since changed their name because that's like a hallmark of these shady firms. Like Blackwater, they always change their name like every year. But they wrote up a report for the Senate about like the danger of Russian trolls, right? And they include the actual screenshots of the Russian Facebook ads that supposedly destroyed our democracy. And there's this one ad where there's like there's an image of Jesus consoling a young man, and the young man looks very upset. And Jesus says to him, if you're having problems with masturbation, reach out to Jesus and we'll beat it together, right? And so these Senate contracted spooks, okay, writing in an official Senate report, like the Senate stamp is on this report, okay? It says that this was an example, in their words, of the Russia's recruitment strategy, where Russia was exploiting Americans vulnerable to masturbation to try to recruit assets. I mean, this is the level of idiocy and profiteering that Russiagate produced. I mean, it's funny.
And after Aaron,
serious.
we're going to be bringing on several victims of that ad who were recruited by Russia after they. I mean, imagine actually believing that. Jesus. I mean, no pun intended.
Should be here all weekend, folks. Wow. I mean, that's wow. That's I don't even really know what to do with that. That's wow. I mean, yeah. Only in an agreed upon fiction could that really survive to where people would somehow feel comfortable putting that in a Senate report. But it does speak to, I mean, I know some people have called it Russia derangement syndrome, and it's a little tongue in cheek, but I mean, it does have a certain sort of ring to it because it is funny, but then you do remember that like, whoa, wait a second, millions of people actually believe this and are acting on the basis that this is true.
It is. And again, I keep going back to what a lost opportunity the whole 4-year thing was for the Bernie movement. Like, think about 2016, okay? So you have these emails coming out showing that the DNC and Clinton campaign, they hate Bernie, they hate his movement, they hate his supporters, they're conspiring against him, they're rigging the primary. Hillary Clinton saying one thing in public and then saying another thing in private to Wall Street. And then, not only that, they lose, okay? They can't beat Donald Trump, which should have ended their political movement forever. They lost to Trump. What happens instead? Hillary Clinton and her campaign, they start blaming Russia. They come up with conspiracy theories that Trump is a Russian agent. And the Bernie movement, led by Bernie, instead of saying this is bullshit and sorry, you guys lost, it's time to just accept that and now it's time for a new party, they accepted the Russiagate narrative. They propped it up. Bernie Sanders introduced a measure to stop Russian interference. He speculated, like everyone else, that Trump was compromised by Russia. And of course, he didn't Russiagate to the extent that like Nancy Pelosi did. Because Nancy Pelosi had this famous mantra, she said all the time that when it comes to Trump, all roads lead to Putin. It's literally her mantra. Mm-hmm. But Bernie still didn't challenge it, and he still propped it up. And I think looking back now, I mean, maybe there was the political calculation that for him to challenge it, that would be too politically costly, it would be too energy consuming. But I think it was a mistake in retrospect because, the Bernie wing let the neoliberals prop up this fake narrative that they use solely to protect their own power and privilege. And I think we'll be living with the consequences of that for a very long time.
I think we will too, unfortunately. But fortunately, Aaron, we have people like you out there who are at the coalface helping explain all these things, unearth them, and, give us the real story. So thank you so much for giving us some of your time, joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, Rania, I would say the pleasure's all mine, but I see that the chat's already having a little fun with me there, and you are too by sending that to me. But the pleasure was all mine. Aaron is doing great work. He's working on the Gray Zone. He's got the Pushback. He's writing in The Nation about this. He's also got his own Medium page where he's publishing on this and many other things. So Aaron Mate, check him out across all platforms. He's also on Twitter at Aaron J. Mate. M-A-T-E. So I think we're just going to keep the movement moving forward here, Rania. And now we want to turn to the Xi Biden summit, or perhaps Biden Xi summit, however you want to look at that. That took place earlier this week, at the beginning part of this week. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by KJ No, who is a peace activist, a scholar on the geopolitics of Asia, and also an organizer with Pivot to Peace. KJ, thanks so much for being back with us.
Good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you back with us. Obviously, a ton of implications for the world come out of U.S.-China relations, so this is a big meeting. Now, I'll say, KJ, I was looking at this, and nothing concrete came out of it, but I was relatively encouraged that it seemed like there was some tamping down of tension. So my first question to you is this: am I being too optimistic in my reading of the Biden-Xi summit being a sign that perhaps things are at least ratcheting down a touch?
You know, I think we all want to be optimistic because the tenor of the dialogue has been so hostile and so, threatening. So clearly, we didn't see the usual rhetorical excess and demonization, which usually precedes and comes right after a meeting. Usually, the Biden administration has had this real Jekyll and Hyde approach. That is to say, it says something incredibly demonizing, and then it goes into the meeting, makes nice, and then right after the meeting, something hostile comes out. We didn't see this Jekyll and Hyde done to the same extent as usual. And the readout from the White House was 17 sentences long. Usually the readouts are about 5 or 6 sentences. So they're almost like Kremlin bunker, near Mirandized statements that let you know that they don't want to share anything that happened. So that was a change. But still, there's a large difference in the readouts. The US is mostly boilerplate. The only thing that they mentioned was the one China policy, which they affirmed, but they poisoned that well by mentioning the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances rather than the 3 communiques, which is the real international relationship. That's the real international law that governs that relationship. And on the Chinese side, the Chinese sent out a clear warning. They talked about 3 things that they want. They want peace, respect, cooperation, very commonsensical. But at the same time, they pointed out that the U.S. is playing with fire over Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. I mean, so with the issue of Taiwan, a lot of people, or I at least heard this analysis, is that, before the rhetoric around Biden's rhetoric around Taiwan was quite hawkish. On several occasions, he had stated that if China invades Taiwan, we're going to literally militarily defend Taiwan. We recently learned that the U.S. Military has had people stationed in Taiwan for at least the last year, training the Taiwanese military. And so then, at this meeting, we hear Biden, toning it down a bit and saying, oh, well, actually, we don't recognize, I think it's that we don't recognize Taiwan. So, I mean, is that more of kind of, as you see it, it sounds like that plays into what you're saying as well, as kind of saying something big and then toning it down. But I mean, is that little bit about Taiwan at least perhaps a little bit encouraging, or do you not think it means much?
Well, it's a return to the status quo of strategic ambiguity, essentially, that, the U.S. does not take a position. Although they said that if they said, interestingly, that Taiwan is independent to make a decision about its own independence, which is a little bit of word game going on. But, the 3 communiques between China And the United States recognize there's only one China, that the People's Republic is the legitimate government of China, and that Taiwan is a part of China. This is the backbone of US China relations. Remember, the Chinese fought the Japanese for decades. I mean, Taiwan was taken away from China in 1895. The Chinese fought the Japanese colonialists for decades, hoping to recover what had been taken away from them. 25 million Chinese perished in this struggle against the Japanese. And then for Taiwan to be taken away arbitrarily by the United States and given to this fascist anti-communist state as a kind of, consolation prize and platform to attack China. That's something that the Chinese haven't they consider it to be unfinished part of their revolution. The other piece, which is very, very troubling, China considers Taiwan to be part of its core interest. And the reason for that is Taiwan is so close to the Chinese mainland. It's 80 miles away. It's like a pawn which has advanced to the 7th row. And if that pawn coordinates with other pieces, or if it makes one step forward, then you know that the end game is nigh and the game is over. And so that's why the Chinese are so extremely sensitive about Taiwan. That said, they do not want forcible reunification. They want peaceful reunification. And that the fact is that probably between 1 and 2 million Taiwanese live, work, or study in China, and about 90% of Taiwanese have family relations in China. So they don't want any kind of escalation. This escalation is pushed by the United States and the Quisling administration of Tsai Ing-wen, the DPP in Taiwan right now.
I think one of the elements of this, KJ, that is, well, very important, I think, in terms of how we understand it. And I think it also speaks to the issue of, the lack of real concrete commitments on the United States side. And I think we could also say this about the COP26 thing, is that in Congress, nothing has really changed. I mean, even if Biden had changed his mind, I think it was the day before this, the Wall Street Journal ran the article about investment houses investing in China and saying that there are people in Congress trying to bring forward legislation to stop that. There's the Schumer legislation. I mean, even if, let's say, Biden did want to turn things around, it seems that everything that's teed up in the U.S. Congress is designed to go the opposite direction and to ratchet up tensions. And a lot of those bills still may pass, actually quite handily.
This is a bipartisan consensus that has been building since the 1990s, when we had, quote unquote, the blue team and all the people who were bashing China. They never went away. They continued. They built their infrastructure and their alliances. And we saw it kind of culminate in 2009, 2011 with air-sea battle, which is the war doctrine against China, and then the pivot to Asia, which was architected by Kurt Campbell, who is currently the Asia czar, the China czar in the Biden administration. It's a bipartisan approach. It has been building for decades. It goes back to the old tropes of yellow peril and Red Scare. But you're absolutely right. There are currently 500 plus bills in Congress bashing, demonizing, attacking China. I've lost count of them. I stopped counting after several hundred. But all of this is to say there is so much momentum towards escalation and hostility to war with China that even if Biden were to disavow the 16 war hawks that he's brought in from CNAS into his administration, there's still so much legislative momentum, as well as so much hybrid war going on, that it's not easy to turn this ship around.
One thing
KJ,
No, please.
Okay, well, I was just gonna ask, when we talk about this new Cold War with China, we think about the last Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union and how much damage that did all around the world. And then when I think about this new Cold War with China, which we're really, I feel like, in the beginning phases of, so far it's been very damaging, of course, for diplomatic relations. It's been damaging in terms of what the U.S. has done to Hong Kong. It's very damaging in terms of what the U.S. is doing around the Taiwan Strait. However, I guess, can you give us an idea of the potential damage that could come as this Cold War escalates. In many ways, that could become a hot war in so many different places around the world?
Well, this is the scenario that I don't want to envisage, but to, cut to the chase, it could very easily result in nuclear war. China has a very, very minimal nuclear deterrent. 200, at maximum 300 nuclear weapons. They're all detached from their launch vehicle. So it has no launch on warning. It doesn't have hair trigger. But the US nuclear force posture and US strategy is to use nuclear weapons if its strategic interests are threatened. Uh, and it considers permissible nuclear first strikes. So that's the worst case scenario, and I wouldn't put that off the table. The fact that China has such a small deterrent is actually makes it more likely that it could go nuclear rather than this kind of escalation ladder and give and take. So that's the other piece. But in the immediate and direct effects that we can feel is that for a long time, since the 90s, the US and China have had their economies intertwined. To a certain extent, they're like conjoined twins. Trump and then Biden, continuing Trump's doctrine, is trying to decouple or separate these conjoined twins. Now, what they forget is that China has the beating heart. And if you separate, guess who has the heart? When I say heart, I'm talking about manufacture. China is, the industrial manufacturing powerhouse of the world. And once we start to disengage with that, then that will create massive effects on the US economy, which we are already seeing in the inflation. We see that because of the Trump tariffs on Chinese goods. Those tariffs have not affected China. We're importing 30% more than we did before the tariffs were imposed. But we are also seeing inflation partly due to the tariffs that US consumers are paying themselves. But, in general, all of this bodes badly in terms of academic cooperation. The global knowledge commons is how we develop knowledge together. That is being decoupled through this academic, researching while Chinese, attacks on Chinese researchers. And so there are so many ways in which cooperation, which would be useful for both countries, is actually creating harm and damage. And I would argue that most of that harm and damage is accruing to the United States.
Mm. Mm.
In terms of the implications there, and I think that's a really important point, both the implications of cooperation and the implications of, more hostility, and seeing that Biden requested this meeting, to what degree, KJ, do you think that Biden is also messaging not simply to Americans, not simply to China, but also to other nations who, obviously publicly have been growing more concerned about this, and I'm assuming privately have been saying similar things? Do you think that some element of why this meeting happened when it did is designed to tamp down general discontent in the world, that is, with how aggressive the U.S. has been towards a new Cold War?
I honestly couldn't say if that is the case. Clearly Joe Biden is having domestic issues at home. So he needs to kind of, there's only so much aggression and oppression that can be, manifested at once. The other piece is that, the U.S. is starting to enter into an economic, death spiral right now. And remember, in 2008, Hank Paulson went to China and essentially asked the Chinese to save the US's bacon. And the US and the Chinese did that by buying massive amounts of US securities. So there's a kind of pragmatic, ask that the US is trying to make. They're trying to get economic cooperation. They're trying to tamp down in certain areas while maintaining the full court press in other areas as well. So I don't see it as really a change of heart so much as it is a kind of tactical recalibration while the strategy remains the same, which is to take down China.
Mhm.
You know,
Makes sense.
it's no, sorry, Rania.
No, I was
Well,
saying
let,
it
let me
makes
let
perfect
me yeah.
sense.
hmm
No,
let
go
me
ahead. Continue,
clarify that.
KJ.
The Pentagon has claimed China is the pacing threat. The U.S. elites, through official, quasi-official sources, state that China is the greatest existential threat to the United States. Eli Ratner says everything must be oriented around competition with China. The U.S.'s explicit kinetic war doctrine, it talks about deep strikes inside the Asian continent, i.e. China. The third and fourth offsets are all about finding a technocratic way to defeat China through war. There's endless information warfare. Biden called, Xi a thug and ran on the platform of being tougher than Trump against China. So, the U.S. hasn't undone or gainsaid any of these statements. It hasn't dialed down its posture. What we see is a kind of, tactical maneuvering, and I see that inside the context of the hawks, the China hawks that dominate China discourse and policy inside Biden administrations, all come out of CNAS. CNAS is known for the massive catastrophic failure of Afghanistan, which was due to their policy of Cohen or counterinsurgency. They characterize counterinsurgency as carrots and sticks or armed social work. That is to say, you hand out soccer balls at lunchtime and then you break down and break into houses at dinner time. It's good cop, bad cop, carrots and sticks, hot and cold, Jekyll and Hyde. I think the Chinese are likely to see what the US is doing from that perspective. And you can see from the Chinese press is they're saying, okay, the styling down is good, but there's still a lot of distrust.
And as there should be. I mean, the U.S. has shown no level of, as you say, they're back and forth. There's no level of consistency here. And then also how they operate around the world. I think it's very clear, from the Iran nuclear deal to many other things, that even if they claim to be sincere, even if they sign a deal with you and say we're going to have peace, you never know what's going to happen and how it's going to turn around. Obviously, it's very difficult to predict how any of these things are ever going to turn out, KJ. But I mean, it does feel, especially in the context of, I don't know, world opinion in the wake of COP26, more and more people wanting to see collaboration and cooperation between the two countries, that the U.S. is sort of, raging against the tide, as it were, of global opinion that wants to see the two nations work together desperately because everyone's lives are at stake.
That's absolutely true. And once again, Chinese have tendered the hand of cooperation. They want win-win cooperation. They want peace. But the U.S. Sees this, in my opinion, as a kind of game of counterinsurgency. What I mean by that, counterinsurgency is not a two-handed game between insurgents and counterinsurgents, but it's a three-handed game where you're trying to undermine or gain legitimacy. And what the US is doing right now, even as it tactically recalibrates with China, is it's constantly waging information warfare to delegitimate China and to build alliances against it. So that's the key dynamic that remains. That's the thing which is the most dangerous. And as long as that remains the case, as long as the information warfare continues, as long as, and we'll see how the Biden administration responds to, whether it will go to the Beijing Olympics or not, or whether it will kind of tar it again as quote unquote the genocide Olympics. We'll see how that goes. But those are some of the key signals. We watch the information warfare that will tell us where we're going.
Well, KJ, really appreciate you, as always, joining us here on the Freedom Side. A lot to sort through on all these issues, but very, very important implications. So, as always, we really enjoy having you on, and thanks for giving us some of your time.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.
No, of course. Well, we know that the pleasure, of course, is ours, all ours, Rania.
Lean into it. Just lean into it. Real hard.
Listen, I absolutely will lean into it.
You feel very slighted by this issue.
I'm not
totally provoked
slighted.
this, by the
I'm
way.
not slighted at all. I just want to make it clear that it is indeed my pleasure to have all of the guests on week after week. They're great people. They're very busy. They have a lot going on. I appreciate that. But as we move through, and I also just want to note here too, if you want to become a patron of Breakthrough News at patreon.com/breakthrough news, you will also be able to get the audio of this episode of The Freedom Side. We're putting the audio up as a podcast. I know that was something that people in the chat and other patrons have been requesting for some time. So go to patreon.com/breakthrough news, patreon.com/breakthrough news. Become a patron, and you can get access to the podcast version of The Freedom Side. Same content, but in a podcast, which people wanted. So, there it is. Ronnie, you look excited about that. You love podcasts.
I'm much more of but shockingly, we make videos here, but I'm more of a podcast listener than a video watcher myself. So
respect. Well, we're gonna keep moving forward here on the show, and we want to turn to another crucially important issue. That is the trial of the 3 killers of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. And we are very happy to be joined with the Atlanta-based journalist and host of the podcast, The Way with Anoa Changa. Anoa, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side. No, very happy to have you here. And, there's so much that can be said about the trial, but the thing that I just keep sitting with, Anoa, is the defense of how they're saying, well, look, at least Travis McMichael's lawyer is saying this, they were going to make a legal citizen's arrest or whatever. And it's just like this long history of vigilante violence in America. And I thought, regardless of whatever the statute is, and I definitely don't think they were in conformity with it, just the idea that they just felt they had the right on a whim, basically, to track someone down, try to arrest them, and when they, essentially try to defend themselves against vigilantes, just murder them right down there in the street. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I just keep sitting with how they feel so right with what they did.
Well, nothing in the prior citizens arrest statute gave them the right to do what you just described, Eugene. That is tracking down a jogger on foot in their trucks with shotguns, right? Something out of an old-timey racist pre-lynching exercise, right? Nothing in the existing law gave them that right. And also what Ahmaud Arbery was allegedly accused of would have been trespassing, which was only a misdemeanor. And one of the cops testified earlier on that would have actually been something that would have been given a verbal warning about. But it also was an issue when you look at the footage of the site itself. You see that multiple people, whether you've done this yourself, I actually have done this. You see a construction site, you look around, you see the new builds going up. It was something that actually very commonly happened in that neighborhood. Not with Black people, apparently, is really what the issue is. You saw a white couple on camera. You saw a couple other people on camera, multiple different people, not just Ahmaud. He never touched anything. You actually see people on some of the video footage touching things on the construction site, right? So this idea that they were doing this community service, we saw the same thing with George Zimmerman, the overzealous community watch type of attitude, mentality, and this idea that because you're a good guy with a gun, that you're entitled to do any and every action it takes to stop what's the perceived Black guy. But the other thing I would say about this is the citizens arrest statute has been very affirmatively updated. It didn't get completely repealed, but it was updated, which was a big push and somewhat of a win down here. But the citizens arrest logic actually comes from the first 2 prosecutors in this case, right? There's no indication that any of the 3 individuals actually argued or alleged or tried to claim that this was a citizen's arrest prior to that information being made publicly. So we first hear of this citizen arrest bill come from George Barnhill, who was the second prosecutor to actually handle this case before it was taken out of his hands as well. And he wrote a very lengthy letter describing why this was citizen's arrest, distorting facts and evidence that they already had at the time. So not just are these 3 people on trial, but really that entire Southern Georgia judicial criminal system for the prosecutors, et cetera, and the cops, it's all on trial in terms of the Ahmaud Arbery case.
You know, Anoa, I'm glad you mentioned George Zimmerman, because it seems to be coming up again and again, right? The situation where people commit murder, like they commit a blatant act of murder, but because they murdered somebody who's Black and there's like a racist tinge to it, obviously, and the murderers happen to be white, it's like everything's backwards. The person who's murdered is the one who ends up on trial. Like, well, did they give them a reason to murder them? I mean, it seems like a pattern that we are seeing here. It's again and again. Like, why are we even discussing? I just can't think of other murder cases where it's being discussed. It's usually the person trying to say it was either an accident or no, it wasn't me, I'm being framed. Not, okay, yeah, I totally did it, but I was right and it's self-defense. I mean, this seems to be an ongoing pattern. It's incredibly disturbing. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of this? Like, is that becoming normal?
What I think we're seeing more so right now, and I think it's pretty raw right now because we have both the Rittenhouse and this trial happening at the same exact time. We have 4 vigilantes, arguably 4 white supremacist vigilantes, all on trial at the same time, making very similar disparaging, comments about the people that they killed, as well as claiming that they had no choice, they had to do it with self-defense. I mean, it's really wild that you get to claim self-defense when you are aiming a gun at someone else, right? And they're trying to make a lot about how Ahmaud may have tried to take a gun from one of the McMichaels in particular. I mean, if you're pointing a gun at me and I don't know who the hell you are, yes, I'm going to try and disarm you and save my own life. If anyone was acting in self-defense, it's clearly, Ahmaud Arbery in this case from all the facts that we have available. But I think to your point about, is it becoming more commonplace? I mean, this is actually getting back to the bread and butter of what America is. Rania, you and I know that our people who look like us, if they're on the wrong end of a gun, it's not going to end pretty. And if we're on the other end of the gun, it's still not going to end well, right? When we look at the ability of people of color, Black folks in particular, their ability to claim self-defense when the defendant whether the victim is Black or white, it's abysmal in comparison to their white counterparts. I don't remember the exact stats, but I know it's come up when we saw, the conversation around stand your ground. Stand your ground specifically is a little bit of a peculiar bastardization, for lack of a better phrasing, of traditional self-defense law. When you think about traditional self-defense law, there's usually a duty to retreat, right? When in a situation, you're usually not the person escalating under, the idea of, when you have the castle doctrine, that's like when you're in your house. And in some cases, they've even found out like people have a duty to de-escalate it, even when they're at home, which has been a peculiar deviation from the norm. So the armed person who's escalating conflict to then turn around, try and say, no, we weren't really doing that. But it's also really grounded in this perception that anyone who's Black, brown, anyone who's non-white there is reasonable suspicion, not only to detain or suspect them of a crime, but to take any means necessary to stop them from the perception. Because really what it is that perceived othering that happens within someone's head has already been, we've seen across our judicial system that type of perception, that type of scrutiny is acceptable, whether it's the Supreme Court cases. There's a line of criminal procedure cases out of the Supreme Court that have found that Black men in a car in DC is reasonable suspicion enough for cops to stop them. That type of mentality permeates throughout, white communities in general. Not saying all white people, for folks who are white in the audience who may get a little upset about that type of stuff, but it's a very real thing that we're trying to cut through. So, I mean, we also saw this post 9/11 with the increased surveillance and suspicion, you know, when we're talking specifically of people who are perceived to be Muslim or of Arabic descent, you know, the way in which we had antagonism from not just police, but vigilantes who thought they were doing the American patriotic thing. We're going after people. So this is really more about what we have seen throughout American history and the way in which white vigilantes have been empowered by the justice system to take action. And that continues on, particularly when we're talking about some of these smaller Southern communities or smaller communities that exist outside of maybe some of the more larger urban centers that have had to grapple with these issues in previous years.
A little bit of Noah, and oh, sorry. I was hoping you could actually talk
were a
about that
little
last aspect a little bit there, Noah, that you mentioned in terms of demographics, because it's a big conversation about Georgia, as many conversations in politics, a little overplayed, but you know, Georgia's changing. It's got all these demographic changes. It's not like these other southern states. It's a new place and all these other pieces. But as you say, this is really drawing us back to, you know, maybe the Georgia that many people know. I don't know if that was ever representative of everyone there, of course, but certainly that long racist history. I mean, where do you think this sort of situates us in that conversation? I mean, was it overblown to begin with, or how are you seeing that?
Oh, no. I mean, I think the demographic conversation is a very real one. And that is how we're going to be able to build the coalition power to move folks forward for those who engage in electoral politics, right? I mean, I think it has a very real conversation. We do see new leaders emerging. I actually, just before coming on with you all, just saw a tweet that a friend of mine's, a teenager, has their first article in Teen Vogue writing about the school board fights that are happening right now over race and diversity issues and things of that nature. So we have this whole group of young people that are raising their voices in a very real way because they're seeing the importance and value of that organizing. So we do have the diversity, but what I think we have is we still have these segments of the country, and they're not just like, you know, a deliverance type, you know, throwbacks. I mean, these are very real communities that still have people who are very entrenched in their power bases. So the two original prosecutors that I mentioned, you had two prosecutors who originally in the Ahmaud Arbery case, who both touched this case and did everything in their power to keep these men from not even going to jail, but from being arrested, being arraigned, talking to police, anything. They squashed everything and everything until it was the community that got the third and then finally the fourth. This is the fourth. We are on the fourth prosecutorial team now. So I don't think that the demographic conversation, just like nationally, is not a problem. I do think that there is a wing within the country that is harping on this white fear or this fear of the Black or browning of America in a way that has people doing ridiculous stuff, like trying to get mistrials because there are Black preachers comforting the family and the audience, right? I mean, we're seeing there is no veil anymore. There is no pretend that somehow we're in this modern era and people don't still have these beliefs or have these still attitudes that we thought were left behind in the 60s, 70s. I mean, you and I didn't think that, but I think a lot of the country has been confused because being blatantly racist has been like verboten for so many decades now. And now we have seen this rescinding where it's okay to be white and proud in the way that we see a Kyle Rittenhouse, in the way that we see the McMichaels and Bryan acting in terms of how they're, you know, taking care of their communities. So the demographic thing is a very real conversation. The shift is very real and we're seeing it, but it also helps empower people who are in these more rural communities to start doing the organizing and the supports. Because what I do think is important about a state like Georgia and the resources that started coming into Georgia around the 2020 election is that we then saw organizations be able to spend more time and energy in places down like Brunswick and Glenn County, down in Southwest Georgia. We're seeing people spread out more because that's what really needs to happen. People in more of these rural communities, whether they're white, whether they're Black, whomever, folks need resources and support to do this work to help root out some of these people who remain in these positions of power, like George Barnhill, who will be up for re-election in 2022. Jackie Johnson, the first prosecutor, was actually unseated in part because people got behind a write-in challenger to be able to unseat her, in particular after this specific case happened.
Well, that's very interesting to know, and I think a really important point. And I appreciate you giving us that context. And you know, just thinking about the Black pastor piece. And last thing here before we let you go, I mean, it almost feels like it's like psychological terrorism from the defense. I mean, I agree with you. It's definitely a tactic, but just seeing him repeat this over and over, I've been thinking about the family of Ahmaud Arbery and just everyone who's there. I mean, it almost feels like a terror tactic. I know some people might say I'm saying too much with the way too many black people in the jury room, too many pastors comforting the family. I mean, their son, loved one is dead. I mean, it was, I guess I can't say it's unbelievable, but I mean, I just was so struck by it.
Yeah, I mean, especially when it's the thought of a sobbing Black mother who is reliving and forced to relive the murder of her child, right? And is being comforted, and that of itself is also a part of the problem for the jury. I mean, nowhere have I seen the white family or any family being told that the fact that they might be in the audience and sobbing to themselves, not like she's, being dramatic and like wailing hysterically or anything like that. I mean, it's hard as news people to interact with this footage. I can't imagine being an actual family member, right? So yeah, it does seem, and I don't really know what his strategy is, but here's the problem. As a retired attorney, I've been in classrooms with people like that attorney, like the defense attorneys for Rittenhouse, and yes, everyone is entitled to a defense, but the way in which people choose to go about that defense and the types of theories that they choose to advocate for speaks volumes about not the innocence or presumption of innocence, but the white supremacy that's still very much ingrained in the way we teach legal studies in this country, as well as the way in which the justice system and the legislation that people are relying upon to adjudicate works, because none of it was meant for any of us to begin with. And so I know many people have spoken this about looking for justice from this system, and we'll see how these cases turn out. But I'm very, very aggravated with the way these particular defense attorneys, and I'm someone who's usually like, yeah, I wanted to be a defense attorney, but it's pretty gross watching how they're going about defending their clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as always, Anoa, really appreciate you helping us sort through all of this and being willing to give us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Absolutely. Talk to you guys soon.
Great. Absolutely. Well, Rania, I mean, we're going to just keep the movement moving forward here, but you look at this, and the other thing about this trial, I just want to say before we move on, is it really has revealed the violence of this. I mean, I think that what's happened. A lot of people have seen the video, but because of the way, how far away the video is and the way, you don't get a full sense. And, Mr. Arbery, his arm was almost completely torn off. I mean, this is point blank range with a shotgun. And I think it really, seeing some of the video of them tracking him down, you just think how he must have been feeling. I mean, what Anoa was saying about self-defense is so true. I don't think people fully realize this. I mean, they first chase him, he turns and goes in the other direction. So obviously he was trying to just wait them out. This is his normal jogging route. And I'm sure he's figuring, okay, who are these, idiots, probably crazy racists. So let me run back a little bit, then come back. They're still searching him out. Then the next thing you know, they're chasing him down in trucks, trying to box him in. They're pulling guns on him, shotguns, demanding he stop. He doesn't know who these people are. These are completely random people on the street. He's done nothing at all. I mean, it's just amazing that there's even a question.
They murdered him.
Yes. It's amazing there's even a question.
They openly murdered him, and they're claiming that I just can't get over the fact that there are a significant number of people buying that, who think that behavior is okay. And it keeps happening. And the fact that you have two trials happening at the same time, where I feel like vigilante is too generous of a term, just murderers, racist murderers. I know, like, murderers, just right-wing thugs who openly murdered people and now are trying to claim self-defense. And it actually is disgusting to me that there are so many people trying to, like, nitpick about this little thing or this little thing. No, Kyle Rittenhouse came armed. He came for a fight, and he shot and killed people. These other guys hunted a man down and shot and killed him literally because he was black.
Yeah.
Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. These people are murderers.
Yeah.
That's it.
No, absolutely.
End of story.
Absolutely. It is. Well, we're going to keep moving on. We're going to move to another story. Kai Gurley, some people may know that name. He was murdered by police in New York City in 2014. But due to the very long work of organizers across the city of New York, including some of his family members, a street will be named after Akai Gurley. There's going to be a street naming ceremony this weekend coming up here, and we are very, very honored to be joined for the show here by Hortensia Peterson, known to many of us as Auntie, who is the aunt of Akai Gurley and a police brutality organizer, and by Kirby Joseph, also a community organizer with the Answer Coalition and the SOS coordinator with the Audre Lorde Project. Auntie, Kirby, thank you both so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having us.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kirby, let me just ask you real quick. I think for many of us, this is the case we know very well. I can still remember when you first told me about it. But for those who maybe haven't heard of Akai Gurley and his murder, just give us a capsule view of what took place there in 2014.
So on November 20th, 2014, Akai Gurley was going down the stairs. A dark stairwell, poorly lit stairwell in the pink houses with Melissa Butler. For anyone who knows anything about NYCHA, and these are one of our demands when we started organizing this case, the conditions of NYCHA are deplorable, right? These are conditions that people fight to improve every day. So he went down the stairs because the elevator didn't work, but the stairwell wasn't lit, right? Peter Liang and his partner, John Landau, were doing an illegal vertical patrol, meaning going into the building with his gun drawn. So nothing was going on, but his gun was out. And this thing that police officers do all the time. They just have their guns drawn and they walk around as if, people aren't walking in and out of their buildings or going down stairwells, etc. Peter Liang heard Akai going down the stairs, and his first response was to shoot into the stairwell. That was his response. He shot multiple shots into the stairwell and hit Akai multiple times in the torso. Instead of being a first responder, because police officers are supposed to be first responders, right? Instead of doing that, he left Akai bleeding and dying and went to go look for his bullet shellings and argued with his partner to figure out his story to tell his union rep. Melissa Butler, who was with him, was literally sucking blood out of his mouth, trigger warning, comrades, as a way so he wouldn't suffocate on his own blood. It was a neighbor that heard the shots that was literally screaming into the stairwell CPR methods that Melissa never done before, so she could try to keep him alive for as long as possible. And it was a neighbor that called the ambulance while Peter Liang got his story together for the union.
Wow. And just real quick, Kirby, as a follow-up, no real punishment for Peter Liang either, right?
So we did rapid response the day after Peter Liang killed Akai. So we started organizing with folks from Crystal House, Asede, who's a close comrade within this struggle. Our comrade Jody, who's an Answer Coalition, who's actually now an EMT, and a journalist named Josmar, and folks who organize Cop Watch. So we did rapid response the next day. But because the work was so fast-paced, we met Auntie like a day after the funeral, I believe. And we built so much momentum. This is also the same year Eric Garner was killed. This is also like the same year that Mike Brown was killed. Police brutality was like at a peak in movement, that's what people were organizing for. Kind of like what we experienced recently with the uprising. And there was these massive cases all over the city. This case went to court a few months later, I believe within a year. 2015, we were in court. And actually, we got an indictment and we got a guilty verdict from the jury. It was the district attorney, the same district attorney, Ken Thompson, who we sat in his office, who promised Auntie, who promised Miss Sylvia, Kai's mom, justice, who promised Kim Ballinger, the mother of Akai's child, Justice, who actually, in coordination with Judge Chun, reversed the jury verdict. And instead of giving the recommended jail time, gave Peter Liang probation for 5 years and 800 hours community service. So that's what Akai's life was worth. Even though a jury, right, they tell you in the justice system, trial by a jury of your peers, actually gave a verdict that would require Peter Liang to have done jail time.
Auntie, I want to ask you, after 7 years, how does it feel to be just a couple days away from a street being named for your nephew? Oh, I think you're muted.
You're muted.
Oh no.
Not yet. Not yet. Okay, well, we're gonna figure this out. I don't know if it might be on our end. We'll see.
Did you press the little green mic to make sure it's green?
Yeah, I think it might be from our end, maybe. I don't know.
No, it doesn't look like it is. Maybe the best thing to do might be to just get off and get back on.
Yeah.
Is your volume up on your computer? Okay, I think she's gonna.
The good old reboot.
Hey, look.
Sometimes.
Oh, we can't hear you yet. Okay, well, we'll see. We'll get this figured out, certainly one way or the other. Kirby, just to advance the ball here, so I believe it's just in a couple days, a street will be unveiled for Akai Gurley. Talk about the organizing that went into making something like that happen. I don't know if anything like this has ever happened in New York. I'm not 100% aware, but this seems actually huge that something like this could happen.
Yeah, so the whole process started when we had a meeting at Crystal House, and it was a great meeting, and then we didn't talk about it for a while. Me and Auntie have a very close relationship, and Auntie calls me and is like, I want to do the street. I'm like, okay, fine, we'll do the street. So the way that it works in New York City, for anyone to do a co-naming, for a lot of folks, if you are a community leader, if you are a young person that is killed or a pastor, there's a lot of streets named after a lot of cops in New York City. It's very, and most of our streets are named after slave masters, actually. Slave owners and slave traders. And so in order for cases to be heard for a street co-naming, they only happen around 4 times a year. So every quarter or so. We had to get a certain amount of petitions. Now, within East New York, in the community where Akai was killed, because we were so consistent organizing in that community for the past 7 years, all the actions that we didn't go to Union Square, we didn't go to Times Square when Akai was killed. We kept it in the community, and talking to people who were like, yeah, my son was killed by the police. My nephew was beat up by the cops. So all these stories, the same trauma. Folks who knew Akai, folks who saw it happen. And we had to go back there and get their signatures. And when we went back there, people were like, oh yeah, of course, we remember the case. We know you, we love you, thank you for doing this. So we got a certain amount of signatures. I doubled up the signatures because, people like to lose paperwork. But
So be careful.
then the pandemic hit. So you have to you present your paperwork. We had to write a bio. We had to get a letter from the family, from Akai's mother, stepfather, from Auntie, notarized, saying that, please do this. We respect the comrades that are doing this. This is what we want to happen. So it doesn't look like, that we're clout chasing or being crisis pimps, as I like to call them, and taking advantage of the family. And we went to one community board meeting, lockdown happened, And we had to wait until the Community Board 5 started having meetings virtually. And then after we got the yes votes from the community boards, from the transportation committee in that area, we had to wait for City Hall to open up again to start having meetings. And then they voted yes, you know, and this is a Kai Gurley who was somebody who was in the neighborhood trying to go home, right? From point A to point B. But because of all the organizing that we have done in the past 7 years, this long game of resistance, and just so folks know about Auntie, she is somebody, and I say this a lot about all the police brutality families that I've met along this journey because of this work. You know, they're part of a club that they didn't even ask to be a part of, right? They have this membership, but they all organize with each other. So all these families would come to Gurley events. We would go to their events. Folks would support each other, organize together. It was a community effort, but like a movement community effort. It took a long deal of patience and struggle to really connect with the community, to have them accept that there's going to be a street named after somebody that they didn't know, just because of the trust that we were able to build with our organizing. It was all through organizing. And Auntie was somebody who, you know, Auntie has Bible study on Tuesday and goes to church every Sunday. And Auntie will tell you that, you know, if it wasn't for this struggle, she wouldn't be in struggle. She wouldn't be organizing, right? She would go into her daily routine. She's somebody who has lupus, who has a family to take care of and grandbabies to take care of. But this struggle really pushed her into advocating for liberation. Auntie talks about liberation all the time, abolition all the time. 7 years ago, you know, she wasn't really like that. So she grew through this.
Well, then what does this mean for the community? I mean, I think that so often, Kirby, you and I both know, I mean, organizers, community members, friends, family do everything possible to keep the memory of those who have been killed alive, from, you know, murals to vigils and things like that. But obviously there's always such an attempt to just move on by the state, to just whitewash these cases. What does it mean, you know, maybe for the 12-year-old kid who, you know, whatever, was so young, could never remember this, to be able to see this every day moving around their own neighborhood?
That a Kai and anybody who's harassed by police or any victim of police terror, until we're free, until there's no more police terror, will not be erased. And that's a big thing where you have cases, there's several cases, like you mentioned earlier, Comrade, that are right now, police brutality cases that are in court right now, that if it's no longer in the headlines, you don't hear about these names anymore. Like, you just don't hear about them anymore. And to have a street named after somebody who was killed by police, that was made possible by community, by organizers who didn't know him, but believe in the struggle for a better society, a better community, a safer community from police violence. It immortalizes that struggle. Nobody can take that away from anyone. That when somebody's GPS goes off, it says, you're going down the Kai Gurley way, right? Or the family will know that a city fought for them and will remember their son. And other families will know that their family members also won't be erased. There are police brutality families that, when the verdict came down for Peter Liang to have probation, even though they weren't family members of Akai Gurley, felt it. I remember Kamani Gray's mother. I don't know if you remember Kamani Gray, 18-year-old who was killed in Flatbush. And his mother, Miss Gray, was there. And when she heard that verdict, she broke down and cried. She said, if this couldn't happen for Akai, what are they going to do with my son's case, right? And now you have something like this where we can honor victims of police terror.
Yeah, no, and I know we're trying to get Auntie back here too, but you know, I think that's such an important point, because, you know, looking at sort of the sum total of organizing, I think a lot of times that's sort of people, what is this even doing? What is this even changing? But I don't know if this could have happened 5 or 6 years ago. You know what I mean? Right afterwards, or anything like. I mean, it feels that this is also such the culmination of the shift in the populace, if you will, of people who have gotten sick and tired and fed up, and they've heard everything from stop and frisk to the police murders and everything else, and they want to see things like this. They want to see their representatives vote for things like this. I mean, as much as I know the, soon-to-be mayor of New York City is saying that, everyone loves the cops and doesn't care if they do anything wrong, it really does seem like this is such a refutation of the idea that people in New York City don't want to see an end to this kind of police terrorism.
Yeah, and also you don't get to use our struggle and our terror and the violence that happens in our community as a way to shift what's going on. I think that's like something that's like so real that we have to take into consideration, that our stories are not for sale, nor are they for clout, nor are they for anybody's vote. It's reality, right? It's a level of violence that happens every 28 hours in this country. And there's families that can't fight because they don't have the energy, because they're so traumatized, because they don't have the financial backing to get an attorney to uplift their case. Because people in their neighborhoods are afraid to fight, because what does that mean for them if they stand up against a police officer in certain parts that they live in, right? New York City is not Minnesota. It's not Wisconsin. Yeah. So
I want to ask you a question. I do want to ask you one question, and I think I see people in the comments, I see a couple people made this point, and I don't agree with it. It's a bit of a crass question, but I also think it's important to address. A couple people were asking, what does a street name do? Like, can you explain the importance of this, I guess?
Yeah. So one thing that I want to uplift is that when you do police brutality work and you work with families, you uplift the wishes of the family. You allow them space to grow, but you allow room for what they need to be uplifted. And I think that's like very, very important to uplift. When we first started this process, and it was a process that took a lot of time, and I was still organizing all the other areas of work that I organize in and still working and doing everything else I had to do. We were not getting paid to do any of this, right? We don't work for any city council people. This is all our time that we put in to mobilize this for the family. Anybody who does any type of police brutality, political prisoner, mass incarceration work, if you're not uplifting what the family's wishes are and what they feel that they need to move forward in their process, you should not be involved in this work. I just want to say that because it's not about us. Second, we have streets all over our city and our country that are named after literal historical figures that have repressed our communities over and over and over again, right? Whether it be Bed-Stuy, Nostrand, Euclid, Wall Street, whatever you want to call it, are all named after people that have literally, historically destroyed our communities and have systematically indoctrinated us to be what we are now. We are literally decolonizing ourselves every single day, fighting a system every single day that these names have helped build and solidify, right? This is an opportunity of resistance where you have a name of somebody who was killed because of police terror being uplifted by a community that said, no more, we're uplifting him. We are all Akai. When we went out to East New York, when a lot of people didn't want to go out to East New York, because that's not where people who don't live there go, right? It's not a tourist attraction. It's a place that's heavily gentrified, that's heavily impoverished, that is a food desert. When we were organizing out there and we chanted, we are Akai Girly, it wasn't people in movement who thought it was cool. It was the community standing with us and saying that. So not only are we uplifting what the family wanted, but we're uplifting what the community's message was, which is we are all this person and it can be any one of us. And when we took this campaign to this place to get this street, they uplifted the fact that they felt empowered enough to have this street there. This is an empowerment symbol. right? This is not a Black Lives Matter painted street that cars are going to drive over.
Mhm.
This is our statue, right? This is our monument of resistance.
Right on. Well, I really appreciate that, Kirby. The technical issue here, unfortunately, is going to trip us up with Auntie, but we are going to be, as Breakthrough News, at the unveiling that happens this weekend. We're going to be capturing all that, including the words of Auntie. So we will package that and get that out so people can see
She's
the
going to be
empowered
very
community
upset, by the
speaking
way.
about it.
I yelled at her to make sure she got here on time.
No. Listen, I know that no one is actually at fault any way, shape, or form. Sometimes the way this technology is supposed to work, it's not the way it actually works. But thank you so much, Kirby, for joining us. And thank you, Auntie, even though we had some technical issues. Yeah, go ahead.
The last thing I want to say is that the struggle doesn't end just because there's a street.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that I just want to uplift too, is that Auntie, myself, and all these other families that are going to be out there to support the Gurley family on Saturday at 1 p.m. on Euclid, on Elder and Linden Boulevard, will continue the fight because they believe in the liberation struggle and the end to police terror.
Right on. I appreciate that. I think that's an important point. Thanks so much again, Kirby, for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Bye.
Well, we're going to keep moving forward here, Rania. You know, very excited about this street naming. Sorry about that technical issue, but again, we will be there, so we'll have more to report on this story, and we'll continue to report on every police brutality story that's out there that we're capable of reporting on, because it has to be brought to the forefront. Now we want to turn our attention to the island of Cuba, where allegedly there was supposed to be a so-called protest. The U.S.-sponsored disruption is what I'd call it, but that's just me, Eugene Puryear, on November 15th. Didn't take place. In fact, most of what we saw were people coming out of the streets in support of the Cuban Revolution there, and really punctured a lot of.
They were meddling in America's plans, Eugene.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, they were meddling.
Well,
in their own country.
it was beautiful to see in many ways, and you can go to our @BT Newsroom and check out some of the videos we were able to put up of folks there on the streets in Havana talking about this issue, the real voice of Cubans. And we are very honored to have another real Cuban voice here with us on the Freedom Side, Johana Tablada de la Torre, who is the Deputy Director of U.S. Affairs at the Cuban Foreign Ministry. Johana, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to join you as well from Havana.
I think for many people who were watching this whole thing kind of build up and seeing the United States just constantly pumping out this propaganda of how Cuba must do this, Cuba must do that, it was very notable to see that there wasn't that much support, really none at all, for this effort against the revolution. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that dichotomy, because the U.S. presents this as there's all these people in Cuba who are just waiting for an opportunity to come out, but the reality on the ground seems very different.
Well, thank you for the question and for the opportunity to present our side of the story, because as you mentioned, for many, many weeks, there have been an incredible misinformation operation being deployed in front of the entire world, mainly in the United States, but also in other places. And even in Cuba, since United States have a very heavy interference operation down here with platforms that are fully funded by U.S. government, but apparently has Cuban names in order for people to think that they are in fact taking information from the street here. The thing is that for you to have an idea, from September 22 till 2 days ago, there were more than 180 statements from U.S. governments and politicians of United States about the very large, massive protests that would be the largest ever in Cuba, from one side to the other to the country. They were calling openly to people to take the streets and overthrow their government, or sort of that. But and everybody knows already what happened. On November 15th, happened what everybody in Cuba, or the overwhelming majority of the population, was looking for. For the first time in 2 years, we had again our schools open, reopened for children to go to school. This in Cuba is a big thing. You know that in Cuba, from kindergarten to a doctor degree is free for all Cubans. This is something that we are very proud. So the news that we were opening the schools, that the cases of COVID-19 decreased to the point that we were able to also open our airports. Just this week, more than 400 airplanes landed in Cuba. This is a big news for us. You know that we have a tourist industry that was decimated by the pandemic. As a different to other countries, the incomes of tourism in Cuba goes to healthcare, education, our scientific community. They were trying for the world not to see that on November 15, all of us could stand in front of the world and be proud that we have more than 8 million Cubans fully vaccinated with our own vaccines. So the whole news about United States offering vaccines to Cuba after we already vaccinated the population is not just cruel, since when we need them, they weren't offering anything, but just more sanction and unilateral coercive measures. But it is also a reason for Cubans to be proud. It's an investment that any country can do from one day to the other. It's a more than 30-year effort. Cuba produced more than 13 of their own vaccines, and we were very successful with Abdala and Soberana. So today, for example, we have just 316 cases of COVID in our country, and just three people died in Cuba. 2 days ago, nobody died. Again, we had a 1 day with no people dying from COVID. So those are the news. We have also grassroots initiative in Cuba taking place. I'm going to stop here so that you can, and of course, people won't go. You cannot. Let me finish with this. They are saying now that it is because Cuba was militarized, because there was a huge federal repressive operation. But you know, and I know that Cubans are not cowards. We overthrow all government that should be overthrown. We overthrow the tyranny of Machado in the 30s. We overthrow the government of Batista in 1959, fully supported by United States government. And if the people of Cuba did not go out to the street to overthrow their socialist government, it's because this government has answers to our claims, to our hopes, to our collective project to develop a nation when we are not working just to please 1% of our population. So the entire thing has to do more with domestic policy in U.S. Is the attitude of a government that would like to carry out Florida, that owe nothing to people in Florida, especially to the right-wing Cuban machinery, political machinery, but that they think that if they emulate Trump by the right, they might conquer Florida in 2022. And in fact, they want to give Cuba to Miami, like the head of the Cuban Revolution, to put it to the right wing in Miami, and to give, exactly, and also to give Florida to the presidency. And none of those things will happen. But we are here, and we will continue to work for changes in Cuba, for transformation. This is the other myth. U.S. is talking all the time about that the Cuban people want changes, and the main obstacle for changes in Cuba is U.S. policy. It is U.S. policy. It's an embargo that had more than 60 years. Is the crazy thing about banning family to get together, to send remittance, to visit each other. We are the dictatorship, apparently. That's what they say. But it's not Cuba who bans Americans to visit. That's crazy. It's very ironic. That is not Cuba banning Cubans to visit U.S. by the other way around. It's not Cuba banning U.S. to visit Cuba or prohibiting people to people. There are 243 measures taken, unilateral coercive measures taken by government of Trump, that now we call them Trump-Biden unilateral coercive measures, because time has passed and they feel very comfortable squeezing the neck of an entire nation. And what is incredibly shameful is that after you were so heavy to make a country collapse, now that we are breathing again, you are going to try also to distort reality and avoid Cubans to go and open their country, open their hotels, open their schools. That's what happened. And that's why people don't want to go out to the street. People don't want to go to the school, to their work, and they also want to continue the permanent effort to improve our revolution. Thank you.
You mentioned that was very, thank you for all of that. You
great.
mentioned the unilateral coercive measures. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, the US has made this big thing of, like Cuba has shortages, without saying that, of course, these shortages are a result of these really horrible, monstrous sanctions policies. Can you talk a little bit about what the sanctions that the US has imposed on Cuba mean for Cubans, for average Cubans?
Lots of suffering, Rania, lots of suffering. In fact, this is a policy that already is the, if I could make a simplification, the Cuban embargo, the Cuban blockade, which is the way that we call it, is the most sophisticated system of unilateral coercive measures on earth, courtesy of President Biden. And this is very cruel and shameful. One of the first measures of this government announced to the world was that they will order, and they did, a review of unilateral sanctions that limited the capacity of states to face and to fight against COVID. Just one country was excluded for that revision. What's the right way to say it? For that
exemption,
for that review,
maybe
exemption. See, just one country out of more than dozens of countries that U.S. had sanctions on was excluded for the order that President Biden gives to review sanctions in order to withdraw those ones who limited the capacity of states to face or to fight COVID. That was Cuba. So upon the 60 years of embargo, the 243 Trump measure to cut every source of income to the Cuban economy, with the tremendous cost for our population, they also, in a moment that we need our friends the most, our neighbors, in the moment that the Cuban people that has been so solidarious, the Cuban solidarity is legendary, including with COVID. You remember the Cuban deployment of doctors to Milan when they say, hey, we need help. Yes. And they fly in hours to Turin and to Milan in Italy. So this country, when we need a hand, U.S. took the COVID as an ally to try to fulfill and to achieve what they couldn't in 60 years. So they say, hey, we have the embargo that is already costing Cuba more than 5,000 millions per year. This is 5,000 millions that belong to the Cuban people that U.S. sanctions take away from us year after year, year after year. Upon that, they also think that it wouldn't be a good idea to include Cuba in that review to ease some of or alleviate some of the suffering that will allow us to buy and make an exception of that comprehensive system of sanction that is unique, because it took the level of absurdity for us to buy raw material to make our vaccines for the very first time in history of the revolution, at least recently, because Cuba produced, thanks to the embargo, almost 90% of our domestic pharmaceutical products. But for the first time, after U.S. registered Cuba as a terrorist state or as a state sponsor of terrorists, that was an initiative of Secretary of State of Trump, but Biden was very comfortable, or Biden team was very comfortable to register Cuba on January 22. That was under democratic government was. Immediately, more than 30 banks of the world cut their relation with Cuba. Immediately, health and pharmaceutical companies say, we are not going to trade more with you. And that was in a moment that we needed the most. In the summer, during the episodes that gave them, that they tried to capitalize to mobilize the Cubans artificially, because it was an operation where that experts already are publishing evidence that just 2% of the tweets and the propaganda calling for the march were coming in reality from Cuba. So 90% of the whole volume of misinformation was coming out from US sources. So that's why people were saying, hey, there's a lot of movement to the hashtag 15N. But the Cuba Vive, that was our hashtag in order to tell the world and call the attention, hey, this is a country when people are standing up, that we already defeat COVID, that we are opening our school, that despite US efforts to crash and wreak havoc in this island, we defeat them again. The COVID, the US embargo, the US 243 measures, 50 of them during a pandemic. This is, in Spanish, is a crimen de lesa humanidad. In English, I don't remember exactly what's the name, but it's a crime against humanity. And somebody in US should respond of what were they thinking when they considered that we Cuban had no right to import our products. Well, the good news is that we were able to overcome that difficult situation. So yes, the U.S. policy provokes lots of suffering in Cuba for many years, but especially in these last 2 years. But they failed. They failed very in a way that is almost catastrophic in not having the so-called huge march that I don't know why they misread Cuba, as my boss said the other day, again and again. They don't know us. And of course, there's what the bottom line is, that they consider or they think or somebody guide them to think that you can present the opinion of a small minority that respond to U.S. interests as the voice of the majority. So when there is a huge distance between the narrative and reality, when U.S. talks about the Cuban people and protecting the Cuban people and helping the Cuban people, they are not talking of the Cuban people. They are talking of a group that benefit every year from more than 20 million that U.S. Congress approved on meddling. In fact, it's violating international law. Is also ignoring the claim, the universal claim, that for 30 years in the next September, the universe have been doing is, we're talking of 184 countries versus 2, US and Israel, calling US to put an end to this inhuman policy is an abuse, So this narrative turned to be an illusion. As is also not true that they care about the Cuban people. If they care about the Cuban people, leave the embargo. If socialism is the most inefficient system, let us die alone. You will need to spend so much millions of U.S. taxpayers to show the world that we don't work. United States government will need to take away $5,000 million from the Cuban people every year to prove them wrong. There's something absolutely twisted here. And Cuba, we will continue working. We will develop our economy. We will transform our society as we are doing. We have many changes in Cuba. We are approving a new law code for families to get more rights, to give gay people more rights. We are having more and more mechanism of democratic mechanism for dialogue between the government and different organizations, grassroots movement. Now there is a heavy movement in the neighborhoods in order to improve the condition of life of the less favored people in our society that have been more affected also by the impact of the US blockade. So we have hopes, we have enthusiasm. We think that if we already overcome this difficult situation despite US. And the other thing that they're saying all the time is that they have to provide Cubans with internet. And it's the same with the vaccines. They are offering internet to a country that has internet all over the country. They are offering vaccines now. A week ago, US offered 1 million vaccines to Cuba. Precisely when Cuba is making headlines all over the world because our wonderful vaccines, Abdala and Soberana, are being not just successful with the Cuban population. Guyana, Cuba was the first country on earth to vaccinate their children with wonderful results. That's why they're going to school. And now we are helping others with our vaccines. So in Asia, in Latin America, are also countries that are taking the vaccines. And of course, US won't allow Cubans to visit US because they are not vaccinated with the vaccines that US recognize. So this is another obstacles that the Cuban families will have to face to get together. Besides, US government announced suspension of all flights even before the pandemic to the Cuban province. Besides of suspending and prohibiting the cruise ship with the whole fantasy of the Cubans attacks US diplomats. Everybody knows this is not true. They also suspend the people-to-people contract, but we are the totalitarian states, and we are telling America, hey, come, you're welcome to come. The visa to come to Cuba is the easiest to obtain in the world. You get to an airport where there is a flight departing from Cuba, you buy and you buy a visa. And this is the situation that we have now. We, of course, are not happy with US policy, and we will continue facing it. We will continue call it by its name, which is because it's an abuse and it's inhuman. But at the same time, we won't stop on that. We will, with our own resources and forces and with our own people, we will move forward. US wants Cuba to move backward. When they talk about change, there's one, they don't care about changes. In fact, they are afraid of changes in Cuba because they know that the changes that we are applying now, enforcing in Cuba now are the result of the public consultations that are so common to a revolution like the Cuban one. Without public support, there's no revolution. So those changes they are afraid of, because those changes will make us stronger. Those changes will help the Cuban revolution reinvent itself again and again as it should be. And it will be and it will be very difficult for them to carry on their very dark plans against our people.
Well, I just have to say, I don't think it can be said better than that. I mean, I really appreciate you being willing to join us here on the show, Johana. I mean, I want everyone to see this. We're going to have to clip this and put this out. That was fantastic. I think the real Cuban side of the story got out there.
Can I say something last? Please. Just one word?
Please.
I just would like to thank you for the opportunity to present the word of my country, but at the same time, I would like to express deep gratitude from the people of Cuba to so many people in the United States that have been so solidarious with Cuba these 2 years. It's unfair to speak just about government of Trump or Biden. U.S. is bigger than that. The Cuban people has received all the way the warm greetings and help and even aid on planes like Pastor for Peace. Just by the way, Pastor for Peace landed in Cuba also on November 15th.
Yeah.
With many religious denominations, NGO, who was the same with the aid in order jeringuilla, se dice syringe.
Yep.
The shrinks to vaccinate our population that also came that came from the United States. So we would like to send also Cubans living in US because the people who speak or that they pretend to speak for our Cuban immigration, in fact, do not represent them. I would like to tell you that the Cuban and the larger population of the Cuban immigration would like also to live in peace with their country of origin. So it's that corrupt political machinery that is pressing U.S. government together also with the oligarchs of other parts of the world. Listen, sometimes you just need to know who is supporting what in order to take a side. When you look at who's supporting these efforts that U.S. have been putting so much energy and money, you will see all right winners of the on the planet signing letters. I won't mention names because Cuba is a country that get along with everybody, but definitely not with the enemies of the countries.
That's right. That's right.
And the peoples.
Well,
thank you.
Johana, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side. We really, really appreciate it. I know
Thank
you have
you
a
so
lot
much.
going on. So thanks for coming in and enlightening us about what's
Thank
really
you.
happening.
Thank you. Thank you.
course.
Thank you for the opportunity again. Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
You too. Well, I have to say, Rania, it couldn't be said better than that. I mean, that is the whole
crash
flop
course.
of November
Crash course.
15th. I mean, that let it know why it flopped and why Cuba still stands despite. There's no country on earth that has endured what Cuba has endured and not changed their essence one iota. And I think the level of just wonder that people can have it, the strength of the Cuban people. If they didn't want that government, they wouldn't have it.
It also, I think, speaks to the strength of Cuba's revolution. Like they're doing something right. And there's so much to learn from that. I mean, you literally live next to the biggest empire, most powerful empire in history. And it's this like huge Goliath, and you're just this tiny island with a few million people. And yet, 60 years of sanctions, 60 years of blockade, and this like revolution is still going strong. It's still being passed down from generation to generation. The country is thriving in so many ways, able to create these vaccines. I mean, Cuba really is a place that we should all be looking to learn a lot from, rather than, trying to, which often happens in the global north, talk about what they're getting wrong. I mean, it's an incredible situation.
Really is
but anyways, that said, incredible show we had here.
It was an incredible show that we had here. And now that you mentioned that, Rania, there's a podcast version of this, an audio version of this that you'll be able to get, but only if you go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron. You can get the audio version of this show, the podcast version of this show, and many other fantastic things. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget, again, hit subscribe, hit the bell, make sure you get all of the fantastic content that we are putting out here on Breakthrough. Next Thursday, we will not be with you. So hopefully for everybody for all those who all do have the opportunity to have some time off from work, please have a good time off. Please stay safe. And we'll be joining you very soon here again on the Freedom Side.